Additional sanctions are expected to be imposed today on North Korea. That's according to a tweet from President Trump. Today, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, told the UN that North Korea's missile launch brings us closer to war that the U.S. doesn't seek. She also called on China to cut off oil from the north. North Korean officials say the missile launch yesterday can carry a large nuclear warhead and has significantly more power than previously tested missiles. For more, I'm joined by Professor Doowan Lee, lecturer at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. Professor, thanks for joining us. Is Ambassador Haley right? Are we closer to war with North Korea?
Well, I think, in terms of the capability itself, I think is a huge step forward. But at this point, I like to, address a bigger issue about the North Korean nuclear weapons program. And that is, I think we tend to focus too much on the capability they are pursuing as opposed to why, they've been so aggressively pursuing this capability. And to me, this is not an inconsequential issue, because once we start understanding what underlies, behind their motivation, so to speak, I think it opens up really big policy options to speak.
Well, let's get to that. What is the motivation of North Korea then? If it's not to have this capability to attack the United States or other countries, why are they doing all of this?
Well, I think, that's the big question, isn't it? Because, if you think about it from North Korea's perspective, using this very, precious capability makes very, little strategic sense, because then it's going to lead to its regime demise, right? So, again, I think there are two big motivations, behind this, weapons program. One is essentially continuing economic development. And if you think about it from Kim Jong-un's perspective, he doesn't have a lot of ideological credibility. So maintaining the political loyalty from residents of Pyongyang is really critical for his platform, and economic development is essentially an important pillar of that platform. Externally, I think what North Korea really wants is some sort of long-term security assurance from the United States. Now, once you start thinking about these motivations, I think we can actually think about a very compelling scenario, and that is we've been putting a lot more, a lot tougher sanctions on North Korea, right? But what do you think those sanctions actually do to Kim Jong-un's motivation behind this nuclear weapons program? I think it leads to more desperation, right? That means he's going to stay more committed to this nuclear weapons program.
But Professor, haven't these deals been offered in the past, where we've offered security assurances to North Korea if they would stop these weapons programs? Those offers apparently have been rejected, and now he continues the weapon program. So it seems like kind of a catch-22 there.
Yes, correct. That's a very good comment. But at the same time, we have to understand that relying on China to maintain these toughened sanctions has not worked too well. And I think that's actually very obvious if you think about it from China's perspective, because tough sanctions are likely to lead to two scenarios, right? Some sort of conflict in the Korean Peninsula, which China doesn't want, or some sort of benign regime collapse in North Korea, which China doesn't want either. Because there's a good chance that it will lead to a massive migration crisis over the Chinese border. So China really has no incentives to work with us to toughen the sanctions. So thinking that the sanctions will somehow tame or mitigate Kim Jong-un's willingness to have a viable nuclear weapons program, I think those are based on some faulty assumptions at this point.
We're almost out of time. I just want to ask you one question that I've never heard been asked before, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this. I understand your reasoning on why China doesn't want these scenarios to play forward. They don't want South Korea to be at their border. In other words, if North Korea fails, they don't want a capitalist country at their border with American forces right there. I get all of that. Why can't the United States put out the idea of ending trade relations with China until this situation is resolved? Of course, that would be a huge economic cost. I understand that. But is that that seems to be the only weapon we really have, short of a military weapon, is an economic war with China.
I think there is a third, option, and that is imagine this. Imagine that diplomacy is a zero-sum game, right? If we start talking to North Korea directly, that essentially lessens our diplomatic dependency on China. And that way, North Korea essentially may have a third option to talk to us as opposed to being subjugated to China all the time. To me, this is something that we've done before. Think about Nixon visiting China in 1972. The underlying strategic logic behind that visit was essentially inducing China to drift away from the Soviet Union. In the long run, that worked really well in our favor. So to me, at this point, preemption makes no sense. We don't even know where all the WMD sites are in North Korea, right? So instead of talking about preemption, I think the big game we have to be playing is how to leverage North Korea to put more pressure on China, as opposed to asking China to help us.
Professor Doowan Lee, I appreciate your time. We could go on and on about this. There's a lot to cover on this topic, and of course, it's not the end of it. We will be having these conversations in the future, and we look forward to having you back. Thank you very much, Professor. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.